the need for constitutional reform for Nigeria. Please, a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Let me skip through the protocols, and for obvious reasons, I'm sure you understand why it's useful for me to stand on existing protocols. Unlike President Obasanjo, I have great advantage over him, and I'm also happy that he was called before me. He did say to you that he will get to heaven before me, and I'm really mightily happy about that, because he has to die before me to get to heaven. So I'm not in a hurry at all. Sir, please, I'm not in a hurry. Unlike President Obasanjo, I am not afraid of lawyers. I have earned my medals with the lawyers because I have spoken at least 3 different occasions over the last 20 or so years. I've addressed the national meeting of the Nigerian Bar Association. I've also served under 3 Supreme Court justices, Justice Oputa, Justice Uwais, and Justice Nikki Toby. So I think I have more than earned my medals in law. I was struck to see Femi Falana, of all people, having to really genuflect to greet President Olusegun Obasanjo. I'm not sure that is something he did with all his heart and all his mind. My job has been made very easy. My job has been made very easy because I think many of you must be pretty tired. And so what I'm going to do, I had prepared a paper. Unfortunately, the organizers didn't tell me that we were going to have a panel designed like this. So I have to skip through the first part of my paper, which attempts to look at the whole idea of the future of constitutionalism, but as a process within Nigeria and also constitutionalism around many parts of Africa. So I will skip through that in part because I think that Nigeria's history is pretty convoluted as far as constitutionalism is concerned. It's not a subject I'm an expert in, but at least I think we can pay attention to the fact that even the nature of our history as a colonial state, as a post-colonial state, also as a nation that was also fractured by a series of military interventions. And as you know, every time the military came to power, the first casualty was rule of law, the first casualty was constitution, therefore the first casualty was the National Assembly. So, and every time we almost ended up like Sisyphus, because every time a military regime comes and we attempt a new order, for those of you who may not be familiar, Sisyphus was said to have angered the Greek gods. And for his punishment, he was asked to roll a stone up the hill. But also in punishment, every time he rolled the stone close to the top of the hill, the gods will trip and the stone will go back and Sisyphus will have to go to the bottom of the hill to start all over again. I've used that metaphor in referring to Nigeria's struggle, not only with constitutionalism, but also with the struggle for democracy. Though both of them go hand in hand, so to say. So, as I said, I'm not going to go through most of that, but it's important to understand the nature of the political landscape of Nigeria. I've often said, rather jokingly, but I think it's important for our records, that we are perhaps one country that cannot speak about how many presidents we have had. We don't use generic terms. If we say, how many presidents have we had in Nigeria? We can say President Obasanjo came twice. One as head of state, one as president. Buhari came 2 times. One as head of state, one as president. Then we have head of interim government. Then we've had all kinds of. So Nigeria's constitutional history is so fractured. We've had a series of constitutions, beginning with the initiative of the British colonialists, right through to the processes that all of us are very familiar with. In my little experience, and thanks to President Obasanjo, who appointed me as Secretary of the Political Reform Conference, I've had a little bit of closeness in looking at the issues and the debate. One of the most frustrating things for me in looking at the history of Nigeria's struggle with constitutionalism is the process itself of making a constitution. And if you compare it, and the paper tries to look at that, but I probably won't go into it, is that unlike the making of the American Constitution, about which I spent a little bit of time in the paper, because the Americans, when they were making their constitution, at least had sources of inspiration, whether it was the Declaration of Independence in 1776, or the American Constitution itself, which came into being in 1787, or the Emancipation Proclamation, in which Abraham Lincoln made the defining statement: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are the rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. That means that essentially, the Americans, in making their constitution, allowed for the fact that there has to be enough space for every individual to pursue, as a matter of right, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The next is the Gettysburg speech, which Abraham Lincoln delivered on the 19th of November in 1863. And it speaks to the issues, because that is where we find our definition of democracy. So American constitutionalism drew inspiration from a range of scholars, whether it's Machiavelli, John Locke, the Bible itself, Thomas Hobbes, Russell, Thomas Paine, Burke, Mills, and even Karl Marx himself. And the result of all this is that you have, in the American Constitution, a document, although it has been subjected to amendments, but you can see very clearly that there was a historical and ideological background to the framing of the American Constitution. In our own situation in Nigeria, part of our problem, in my own little experience, has been the process of even electing those who are going to talk about writing the new constitution. Now, the Political Reform Conference that I served in, we had 400 members. Compare it to the number of those who had to write the American Constitution. And for me, one of the very interesting things, people like Thomas Madison and some of the framers of the Constitution, it's amazing to see the depth of knowledge and the effort that people made to acquire so much knowledge preparatory to writing the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, for example, was said to have, he was living in France, when the issue of writing the Constitution came about. And his friend Madison requested that he should please help him find enough material that they will study. And his friend sent him 195 books just to prepare for this very important assignment. I make the point because if you compare it with the Nigerian situation, where coming to participate in making of the Constitution is always at the discretion of the person who is the president, and he uses other sources of information. But I found that the struggle to represent traditional rulers, to represent the church, to represent all kinds of aggregate groups, ends up with a lot of people with very little understanding of what constitution making is. And what became very clear to me, that most of the people who showed up saw the place as a theater for politicking and political transaction. So you can run through the Nigerian situation, but long story short, it is that first of all, there are no perfect constitutions anywhere in the world. And that in the final analysis, a constitution may be like the finest car that you can have, or the finest aeroplane. It depends on whose hands it is in. I stumbled on a poem, a very beautiful poem, which said that a racket is a racket, just for playing tennis. But it's not an ordinary thing for playing tennis if it is in the hands of Djokovic, or if it is in the hands of Serena Williams or Venus Williams. A football is an ordinary football, but in the feet of Messi, it's a completely different tool altogether. So the point is that a constitution ought to be able to meet certain objectives and ideals. But in the final analysis, it is not so much the quality of the constitution, it is the quality of the men and women who have to operate the constitution. So I would like to, as I said, maybe run through to the end of my paper, where I raise quite a few things, because that's where I discuss what I call, what is the future of constitutionalism in Nigeria? I need to do that so that, the members can have an opportunity to discuss the things that need to be discussed. The first is that let's not be exuberant about how far we have traveled on the path of democracy, in part because there were a lot of ideological contestations around the world, especially after 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, where many African scholars were talking about the new liberation of Africa, because they discovered that colonialism hadn't worked, but that successive military rules and one-man dictatorships across the continent had destroyed the foundations of our freedom, had elevated ethnicity, and created ample room and opportunity for all kinds of non-state actors to embarrass and subdue democracy. So the point to make is that the very fact that we are barely a few months since the departure of the last military general means that we must be modest in our talking about the depth of our democracy and how far we have traveled. The second point is to look at the state of Nigeria itself. Do we resemble a democracy? Do we work like a democracy? Do we talk like a democracy? Because the very fact that up till now, months after our elections and after swearing in a president, we still don't know who is going to be the president of Nigeria until the Supreme Court is over. Very much akin to the introduction of the video assistant referee in football, in which case we are like a man who has scored a goal, but we have to wait for the referee to go to VAR and confirm whether it was a goal or not a goal. It's not evident. It is a symptom of how modest our claims should be, because we very often confuse the very fact that we're in a civilian administration with the notions of being in a democracy. That if we cannot fix our electoral process, which is the defining law for how to choose leaders in a democracy, then we must be modest in our saying that we're in a democracy. Secondly, our judiciary is in a crisis of perception, but also based on the experiences that Nigerians have had. It will not be surprising if ordinary Nigerians think that the only thing the Supreme Court does is to look at election petitions. Because we're looking up to the Supreme Court to help extend the frontiers of democracy and human freedoms. But very often, those institutions with Nigerians perceive that they've now become so severely, compromised. That has consequences for democracy and how we see the process of democratization. We also have a raft of agitations across the country. We have seen the worst face of corruption in Nigeria. Femi Falana, my friend here, will speak about that because he's published a series of articles, talking about what happened under the Buhari administration. They were not the ones who caused corruption, but I think in the last administration we saw the ugliest face of corruption in many, whether in moral terms, financial terms, or other terms. And I'll mention that before I close. We have a country that we are now sharing with bandits. Our very sovereignty, which is guaranteed in the Constitution, is under assault because we have non-state actors, whether you call them bandits or Boko Haram. It is that the entire territorial integrity of the nation is at stake. Because nobody is excited now about being a Nigerian. Whether you are president, whether you are senator, no matter who you are, everybody is working with his, with bated breath, because we don't know. We are literally now being held hostages, by people that are a threat to the very existence of our democracy and our country. Hundreds and thousands of Nigerians are still unaccounted for. They are in the hands of bandits. They are in the bushes. The Chibok girls, all kinds of things. And if the essence of our Constitution is to guarantee a quantum of rights and freedom and the pursuit of happiness, what do we have to say? So when we talk about constitutionalism, we're also talking about a framework for guaranteeing, as I said, the freedoms that document contains. Now, the challenge, therefore, going forward is what can we do? Now, there's a lot of distrust of the judiciary in Nigeria, but I consider the judiciary victims almost in the same way that every institution in Nigeria is suffering a crisis, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's the church, whether it's civil society, whether it's the academia, right across the country. So the question, therefore, is I don't think we should assume that we're in a democracy. We should assume that we're marching towards a democracy, but the hard work is still undone. And that means rebuilding Nigeria after the kind of mess that the last administration has left our country, whether it is in civil society, whether it is in the most immoral distribution of resources and opportunities in Nigeria, We know the documents are there, the evidence is there. I've got stuff on my phone that gives a count of the number of federal institutions that were planted in Daura in the last 8 years, where the president comes from. I come from Southern Kaduna. Had I made this presentation as a keynote address with enough time, I would have shown you bullets. I would have shown you empirical evidence you can measure. That is that where I come from, there is not up till today, since the creation of Kaduna State, one single sign of a federal structure in the area of Nigeria where I come from. When you hear Nigerians talk about the South, when they talk about Southern Borno, Southern Adamawa, when they talk about Southern Bauchi, when they talk about Southern Nasarawa, when they talk about Southern Taraba, when they talk about Southern Kaduna, those areas are contiguous with the areas of poverty, neglect at the federal level. So the point, therefore, is that we need to think a little bit more clearly and much more creatively about how we can mobilize our people and how ordinary Nigerians can see that being in power is not just about opportunity for self-enrichment. Because the sad story, let me put it that way, the very fact that Daura has had the opportunities that it has never had since its existence. And that even Katsina, that is next door, has not seen the development that has taken place in Daura. Nothing personal, but just to say that we cannot run a skewed country, a country with such skewed opportunities and privileges, and pretend that we're in a democracy. So we look, when you look at, for example, what I call the violation and desecration of the Constitution by even those who administer the Constitution, themselves. So I make the point, therefore, that restoring confidence in the professionalism of the military and moving away from seeing the insecurity as purely a military operation to addressing issues of insecurity as matters that concern everybody. You talk to senior military officers, serving and retired, and there is a certain kind of feeling that in the last 8 or so years, because how do you run a country in which there is absolutely diversity, management of diversity becomes the victim? A president has such enormous powers, but what do you use those powers for? I give you one simple example. Something that happened because countries change in the hands of certain presidents. Okay? As I said, I come from Southern Kaduna. We have had 3 service chiefs, and they were appointed by President Obasanjo, whom I must commend. I mean, we look like friends, but we really have a lot of debate and argument. Don't mind what you see outside. He's a man who enjoys debate, but also we confront ourselves with certain realities. But the people of Southern Kaduna remember that he's about the only one who ever appointed a minister who came from Southern Kaduna. Or he's the only one who ever appointed army chiefs who came from Southern Kaduna. So now many of you had the leaked video of my former governor talking about the nature of the distribution of opportunities and so on and so forth. It's not the point. We now have an opportunity to rebuild our country. And no matter what happens, how the Supreme Court ends, how things end in Nigeria, I'm convinced that we have put the past, the ugly past, behind us. The challenge, therefore, for me and for us is to open up the frontiers of opportunity. As I said, presidents have tremendous powers. Under President Lyndon Johnson, after the death of Kennedy on November 22, 1964, Lyndon Johnson took over power. And Lyndon Johnson did some of the most dramatic things that perhaps I believe that even if John Kennedy had lived, he probably would not have achieved. Black people would not have seen the opportunities that they saw under Lyndon Johnson. And I take just one example to show you that if a president has, first of all, a president has to understand his country. Also, you have to understand where people are hurting. You also have to be a man of integrity who understands how to manage differences. The American Supreme Court was made up of white people. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson had decided that a Jew will be allowed to enter the Supreme Court. And even bringing in a Jew to the Supreme Court, the next day, it was reported in the papers that Woodrow Wilson had sent a bomb into the Supreme Court. Now, the Jew was white. But Lyndon Johnson felt that a black man needed to be in the Supreme Court. Then he decided on Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall had expanded the frontiers of opportunity for black people through arguing the case in 1954 of Brown versus Board of Education. And there are certain seismic changes that the Supreme Court can make in terms of how people see themselves. Because that is what opened up the opportunities. But then when Lyndon Johnson became president, he wanted a black man in the Supreme Court. But he didn't know what to do because there was nobody in the Supreme Court that was about to retire. In the American Supreme Court, I think you stay until you drop. Now, one of the youngest justices, Justice Tom Clark, he was a justice of the Supreme Court, only 67 years. But he was a good friend of the president. And Lyndon Johnson now approached him, but he went about it in the most dramatic manner. He wanted a vacancy in the Supreme Court, couldn't find it. So what did he do? His son, the son of Clark, Ramsey, was a Solicitor General. A lawyer called Nicholas Katzenberg was the Attorney General. The president pulled him out, gave him another assignment, and then pushed the son of Tom Clark, who was a justice of the Supreme Court, made him Attorney General. And he played that psychological game because Tom Clark now had to ask himself, how will I be in the Supreme Court and my son is Attorney General? Automatically, he didn't have to be told. He decided to step down because he also wanted to see his son grow. And it was when he stepped down that an opportunity came, and then he pushed the name of Thurgood Marshall. If you read the stories of the debate that went on in Congress just about affirming this man, and you see that if a president wants to do good, he can do good. He has enormous powers in his hands, but his heart must be in the right place. He must also have the right reflexes to understand integrity, to understand fairness, to understand equity. Power in the hands of a criminal can not only reinforce inequality, but endanger a whole society. Now, the process of making Thurgood Marshall member of the Supreme Court took a lot of effort. The president ran around in the middle of the night, blackmailed, let me use that expression, intimidated, harassed his friends until they came to the table. And finally, Thurgood Marshall, on the 2nd of September 1967, was sworn in. And in fact, the president, it was very interesting that Senator Hugo, who actually swore him in, was a former member of the KKK. The point I'm making, it didn't change much, but psychologically. So, for example, when people criticize the Supreme Court, you also understand that sometimes, like the saying goes, don't throw a stone in the market until you are sure that your mother didn't go to the market that day. And by the way, today, 3 years since my mother died, I'm celebrating the anniversary of her death. May her soul rest in peace. But I'm making the point, if I had Femi Falana in the Supreme Court of Nigeria, I can go to sleep. If I have Olisa Agbakoba in the Supreme Court of Nigeria, I can go to sleep. If I have Michael Zokome in the Supreme Court of Nigeria, I can go to... There are certain people that you know that their presence may not solve the problem, but it creates a sense of affirmation. Today, women in Nigeria are asking for a place. And by the way, I've always supported that. I don't think women should be asking for 30%. They should be asking for 50%. But let me tell you, don't clap yet. My conclusions are different from your own. If you are going to give women 50%, and please give them 50%. But they will not be Yoruba women. They will not be Igbo women. They will not be Hausa women. They will not be Fulani women. They will be women from people like us who are not even anywhere in the Constitution. Let them be women. But we can't, because otherwise, what you do is you just continue to reinforce inequality. A system must be so fair that it understands that nobody who is a citizen is on an excursion. Every citizen has a right. So finally, I think that the president of Nigeria must because all these executive orders are meant to correct wrongs. There must be an executive order or an amendment of the Constitution that defines what is the status, the religious status of the Nigerian state. And who has the right and the power to take life without a process? We cannot have a country where somebody comes in the name of whatever may be your motivation. A woman cannot say that I gave birth to this child, I carried her in my womb, therefore I'm going to kill her, even if she does, because she's exercising what she thinks is right. The system will tell her, you may have carried her in your womb, but you have no right over her life. A country where anybody can just wake up and say, you are accused of blasphemy, you are accused of, we're not in a theocracy, we're in a democracy. There must therefore be sanctions and punishment. Because somebody goes and burns my church or burns a mosque, what are the consequences? Over 40 years now, we've been going back to rebuild our churches whenever they are burned. The Nigerian state doesn't care. There must be an order that holds a governor accountable, that holds those to finding criminals who are defiling religion, who are killing people in the name of religion. They have no right to kill even their own people. So for me, these are some of the fundamental issues. The Constitution is very clear. The Constitution is very clear about the boundaries of religion. But we have a country where right now, as I'm talking to you, there are many federal universities where there are no churches, there are no mosques. What are the reasons? In many universities, land has been provided for the building of churches. But vice chancellors, chairmen of governing councils are turning a blind eye. I therefore demand that the president of Nigeria, by executive order, must say that every church, every worship, every system, every federal institution, whether it's medical, whether it is educational, must reflect what Nigeria reflects. Even if there are 2 Christians or 2 Muslims, a place must be provided for them. And I want to make this appeal. I don't know how else to make it, because there are universities that are now, the universities in Nigeria, under you, Mr. President, your good friend was vice chancellor in Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria. But now, universities have been so provincialized that the universities are now literally mere ethnic clubs, where you cannot, the idea that Professor Philip Okonkwo can be vice chancellor in Ibadan, even if he's the most well-connected, is unthinkable. The fact that Afe Babalola, who has sold everything to build a university, to make him vice chancellor of either Usman Danfodio or University of Nigeria and Nsukka, is unthinkable. Because like joke, we have come to a point in Nigeria where the federal government is spending money consolidating prejudices, ethnicity, and deepening the cleavages of local classes. The result, of course, is that we cannot be a people. So when Nigerians talk about ethnicity and so on, it is because the government has not done enough to enforce that. Because if you insist that the vice chancellors because the impression that governments create is that we built this university for this community. So you go to many universities, as I said, the governors, even in state universities, the governors take pride in ensuring that only our son. And that is why the universities have become so convoluted in Nigeria. Every day strike. Because people who are holding the reins of power, many of them are not eminently necessarily qualified. They are just qualified by virtue of religion, or they are qualified by ethnicity. So I close by saying Nigeria needs to grow, Nigeria needs to develop, Nigeria needs to democratize, but that it is important that to make Nigerians treasure democracy, to make Nigerians feel confident about democracy, we must appreciate that the democratization of development, that is that the federal government must make sure that it says it has a map that tells where citizens are. Because if you don't democratize development, you cannot develop democracy. So my conclusion is that the democratization of development leads to the development of democracy. Thank you very much.